Good morning, everybody. Last day of the festival, none of us expected a crowd like this. We are thrilled to have you all here. And look, I see how many people are standing in the back. We have some space on the floor here and up here. Please come on up if standing is hard for you for a full hour. I have a bad back. I know what that's like. Please come up and take some of the floor in here or do it once the panel starts. I'm David Leonhardt with the New York Times. I'm so excited for this panel. This is the kind of thing that I would want to have this conversation with each of these three people, let alone all three of them together, not on a stage, just to understand what's going on in the world. And we all get to listen to the three of them for the next hour, talk with each other. I'm going to ask a whole bunch of questions. We're going to have a conversation. Then we're going to open it up to all of you. Let me introduce the folks on the stage with me. Jennifer Nuzzo is a professor at Brown University, formerly at Johns Hopkins, and runs the Pandemic Center at Brown. Did I get the name right?
You did.
Okay. Jennifer also, she's heard me say this in public before, is the single most helpful expert to me during the 2 to 3 years of the COVID intensity. Jennifer is not responsible for the things that I wrote, however. So if I said anything you disagreed with, it wasn't Jennifer's fault. Next to Jennifer is Holden Thorpe, who is the editor-in-chief of the Science family of journals, a former provost at Washington University in St. Louis, a former chancellor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And when Holden was at Washington University, he really helped, along with the chancellor there, WashU, it's called a chancellor, right? Mark, really made a huge progress in enrolling many more lower income and middle class students at Washington University. Holden had a very specific way of helping increase upward mobility in this country, to which we should all be grateful.
Couldn't have done it without your help.
Carol Martins is a vice president and the director of research at the Dallas Federal Reserve, and can help us think a lot about some of the ways in which these science topics really have effects beyond science and affect our economy and affect prosperity and affect our society. So thank you all so much for being here. I feel really lucky that we have you, as I've already said. I actually want to start with a brief definition of what are the attacks on science. So we're here in part to talk about the way that science is under threat, and I just wanted to ask each of the panelists to give us a sense of exactly what that is. Jennifer, starting with you. When we say that science is under threat right now, what do we mean?
Yeah, so I think we mean a number of things. I mean, I think the headlines have, covered to some extent the very obvious and tangible cuts to research funding, not only the cancellation of grants, but also the freezing of funds. So grants that have already been awarded, just not getting paid what has been contractually owed. Those, I think, have been covered. But when we talk about these grants, it's also training opportunities for junior researchers, training opportunities for students. These are grants for STEM education. So a wide range of things that I think is going to have a profound impact on how we do research and basically if we do research. There have also been attacks of sort of a political and social nature, and that's not new to this moment. Many of us who worked, I've been working in the pandemic field, the sort of public antagonism towards science and the threats that have come along with that has been happening and that has not ended in this moment. So that's there. I would say all of this together is having, I think, a profound change in terms of the culture of science. And if you think about what science is, it's, that spark of creativity, that spark of ingenuity, that aha moment, and that's really hard to do when you're sitting there wondering, can you pay your postdoc? Can you pay your graduate student? Do you have to move your grant to another institution in order to do it? Are you going to be able to still do it? Are you going to be able to do your grant-funded research in time to be promoted? Are you going to be able to remain in the field? When that cloud hangs over the whole field of science, it's just hard to move forward with the same creativity and innovation and ingenuity that American science has been known for. So I just want to say I think the attacks on science are multiple, and all of those matter.
Holden, what do you want to add?
Yeah, that's a great summary, but I would add a couple things. So the first is, you hear this thing that people are losing trust in science. Certainly there are many ways in which that is true, but if you look at the polling, actually 77% of Americans still have believed that science is improving the world. And that's much higher than a lot of institutions. Now, there's a partisan divide within that. which has been apparent in many things that we've done. But it's not really rigorously correct to say that all of America is losing trust in science when we're way ahead of many other categories, and the lowest category is elected officials. So,
Are you sure? Are you sure we in the media aren't below elected officials?
no, it's very close. Yeah. I think the other thing to remember is that, and I'm not taking away any of the problematic things that Jennifer was saying, but it's also very uneven the extent to which funding is being pulled across the country. So the schools in New England that play in a certain conference that doesn't give athletic scholarships are having a lot of their grants taken away. But if you look at the land grants and public universities in the middle of the country, in the South, even in public universities in many blue states, the reductions haven't been nearly as great. And I always tell people as they're processing this, I've been on the road continuously since the inauguration trying to help people process this. And if you go to Virginia Tech, I've been to, or the University of Illinois, Chicago, I went, or LSU, people are still there plugging along, getting their thing done. And that's not to say these same things don't impact that. But I think when you see the high-profile institutions making these cuts, it's important to remember that that is not evenly distributed across the country right now. Now, whether it will be in the future, we don't know, but that's an important thing to keep in mind as you're processing this.
Carol, what do you?
Yeah.
Sorry, hold on.
Yeah.
Carol, what do you want to add to that?
Okay, David. So I'm an economist, so I was hoping to give a couple of numbers behind these
Excellent.
cuts and put them a little bit into historical context as well. So overall, the federal government in recent years provides about $200 billion in support for research and development. About $50 billion of that goes directly towards basic research, another 50 to applied, and 100 or so to experimental development work. Of that, sort of the biggest chunk goes to the Department of Defense, okay? And then the next second recipient of funding is the NIH. After that, you have NASA, you have Department of Energy, and you have the NSF. So the current proposals that are on the table are really about big cuts to the non-defense funding for agencies such as NIH and NASA and so forth. These cuts that are on the table are of the order of 30 to 40%. Overall, the amount of funding for institutions of higher education is slated to go down by close to 50%. Now, there's a couple of things that are offsetting that. So for research and development funding for defense is scheduled to go up somewhat, so that will somewhat offset the overall decline in funding for research and development. And recent legislation or proposed legislation also creates new incentives for research and development for the corporate sector. Okay, so to the extent, that could be an offsetting effect as well. Overall, there's a big reduction in funding. There's other important aspects of current policy proposals that I think matter a lot for research funding, in particular at academic institutions. One is the proposed cap for indirect cost recovery. So when a researcher gets a grant, a big chunk of that grant goes directly to the university to pay for all kinds of indirect costs.
The lights, the heat.
The laboratories, the equipment,
Yeah.
everything that is needed to support. So that typically is ranged from 30 to 7%, so a quite significant chunk of that grant, and the proposal is to cap that at 15%. And then one other thing I want to mention is a proposed change to really tax incentives for academic institutions. The proposal is to significantly raise the tax that academic institutions pay on capital gains from their endowment. And that would just be another thing that would be a serious threat to many research activities at academic institutions.
We're about to do math out loud, which is always a little dangerous, but the $200 billion is federal spending on research, correct? That you started
That's federal only. So that amounts to about 0.75% of GDP. That's already quite low, historically speaking. That funding peaked in the late 60s at about 2% of GDP. And so what we're seeing now is sort of an acceleration of a trend that has been ongoing for several decades of a steady decline as a percentage of GDP and the level of funding supporting research and development.
And if you just think about the history a little bit, and this really didn't used to be a partisan issue. The president who did the most to increase federal R&D was Dwight Eisenhower. I mean, the amount that it went up under Eisenhower in the 50s was quite amazing, which if you think about a couple things that most of you are probably familiar with, the Sputnik moment, the highway system. Overall, do you have a sense for, when you include the private sector and universities, how much we spend on scientific research? Is it 500 billion? Is it roughly, what is it? Is it 300 billion?
So research and development spending by the private sector is I would say an order of 400 or 500. So overall, maybe 2-3% of GDP. The level of funding coming directly from the private sector and the U.S. government used to be about 50-50, coming out of World War II in the 50s and in the 60s. And that proportion, right now, the federal support amounts to about a third of total overall spending in the U.S. economy on research and development.
And I know I'm asking you to estimate here, but if all of these policies go through, including the endowment tax, including the cuts to federal spending, what percentage reduction do you think we will see to that 400 to 500 billion?
So that is a very difficult question to answer directly, because it all depends how private spending on research and development will act to potentially offset some of the reductions in funding that are coming from the federal government. Now, there's a lot of research in my field in economics that has looked at that question, and I would say that the bulk of the evidence is said that most usually increased federal support tends to crowd in rather than crowd out private spending. And I think the main reason is that overall federal funding supports much more basic research, things that the private sector doesn't necessarily find profitable to spend large amounts of money on. And in that sense, it is sort of the federal funding that tends to support more basic research, and then the private sector can take insights and take that knowledge and then do more applied and developmental work to develop actual practical applications of that research. So I would say, by and large, the two are basically complements rather than substitutes.
So, and I know I'm pushing you on an estimate, but so I assume we're looking at least tens of billions of dollars of cuts in this overall pie.
Yeah, so overall, I would say 30 to 30% is kind of based on the latest.
30%. So we could easily be above 100 billion in cuts.
Yes.
Okay.
But that's in the president's budget, and we haven't.
Right. None of this, as far as I know, none of this is actually.
And the reason why this is so frightening, of course, is that when you think about the history of this, it's amazing. I mean, it is hard to think of a single important industry in this country that isn't the result of the three-legged stool of federal basic research funding, higher education and science, and then the private sector. I mean, it's true about it's true about pharmaceuticals, it's true about the internet, which the Defense Department built, it's true about semiconductors, it's true about fracking. I mean, for all of our problems, I assume you all would agree with me that this is one of the great successes of the United States and of federal policy over the last century.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not going to speak with the economists, but it's also been an important driver of our overall economic prosperity. So yes, it's extraordinary, and it's also extraordinary not just in terms of how it was, but it's extraordinary about the moment we are in our society, and how much technological issues, scientific issues, are going to determine the future of humanity. Right now, I mean, we are at the cusp of multiple different technological revolutions. Revolution in the biosciences, revolution in AI. We had lots of sessions about this over the course of this festival. Lots of revolutions in material sciences. This is a moment where the future of life, of our overall attainment of health, our wellness, our prosperity, will be determined by many technological issues for which research will ultimately drive our understanding of it, and also our abilities to capitalize on that revolution.
So Holden, how did we end up here? And I know you and I have talked about this enough I know that you think that some of this science does not deserve any blame for, and other parts of it actually science does deserve from blame for. So I want to invite you to get us into an uncomfortable conversation about how we have ended up here with science under such threat.
Yeah, well, so first of all, let me just say, one of the rationales here is science is a public good, so why should the U.S. pay a greater share than the rest of the world, which is a similar argument we're hearing in a lot of areas right now. But Peter Drucker is attributed the quote, "The best way to predict the future is to create it." And so I wrote a column about that, and my editor convinced me I couldn't say that he actually said it. So we don't really know who actually said that. But there are a lot of
Peer review.
There are a lot of Peter
Fear number
Drucker
2.
fans out there, so I went with that. And so the United States has always, because the knowledge was created here, had a leg up in innovation in the world. But in terms of, what has gotten us into this situation, I think that there are several things about the scientific enterprise that were problematic before and still are. One is that, the scholar Pierre Bourdieu came up with something called the scholastic fallacy, which says that college professors have a tendency to think that everyone in the world thinks about their problem the same way they do. And what that means is that, we're not as patient as we could be explaining things to people who haven't thought about this as much as we have. And that has been a challenge as we've gone along. But the pandemic really brought out that problem a lot because we were all talking about the science part. We were doing so very emphatically and bombastically. We were not very coordinated. I mean, Jennifer was doing amazing stuff. I was writing about this, but I didn't meet her until yesterday. But we were doing all these things on the internet together, telling the world about COVID, and we weren't really very organized. And as a result, I think because we were doing this on Twitter, which is not the world's greatest medium, it wasn't then and it isn't now, we were feeding off of each other, and that kind of made the whole thing a lot more emotional than it needed to be. And as a result, science ended up getting blamed for some things that happened during the pandemic that people didn't like, even though the decisions to do those things were actually made by politicians. So there are plenty of people who would blame Jennifer and me and another 10 or 15 people for the fact that we had a lockdown, when in fact it was politicians in these places who did that. And that's partly our fault, because if we had hung back a little bit more, then we would have been given the politicians a little more responsibility. I think the last thing that really needs to be improved is that in academic culture, there's such a primacy put on the creation of original knowledge. So in science, that's the people who have the pipettes in their hands. That's the people who are generating scholarly papers. And that is only one part of the scientific enterprise. And it shouldn't be the other parts of the scientific enterprise, like communicating science and working in museums and being a great science teacher and all these other things. Unfortunately, in many areas in academia those people are treated as less important than the people with the pipettes in their hand. Well, guess what? The people with the pipettes in their hand did fine. Those aren't the people that, we did great in the pandemic with them. It's the communication and the understanding, how our knowledge fits in with all other knowledge and many of these other things that we didn't do as well at as we could have.
So I want to piggyback off of that. And, as director of the Pandemic Center, I think, there is an important conversation we have to have with the American public about what we got wrong during COVID. But that, I think, is a separate issue from what we're talking about today. And I'm going to say that because you referenced the polling in terms of the high support for scientific research. I just saw a poll that came out yesterday that asked people, do you agree with the federal cuts to science, federal interventions with science? And it is stunning. The vast majority of Americans disagree. The vast majority of Americans want to see increases in scientific research, increases in medical research. That holds across all demographic groups, including educational attainment. So including, I know you like to focus on non-college educated adults. They also want to increase scientific research. And it also holds across political party. It is lower for sure, but it holds. The majority of people want more scientific research. So if we were in this moment where people are like, phooey, you scientists didn't do right by me during COVID, I don't want anything to do with you or anything that you do, that's just not reflected in public sentiment.
Yeah, I'm really torn between two explanations, and obviously the answer is both, right? But to me, one explanation is we have an anti-intellectual presidential administration right now that is hostile to all kinds of things that look like science, and is very hostile to parts of society that tend to have more political liberals than conservatives. And a big part of the attacks on science and education are nothing more complicated than what I just described, right? It's whacking places full of liberals, and a lot of the best way for the government to do that is do it through science, because the government doesn't spend $200 billion on history research, right? So they can't whack Harvard that way. And I really do think that's an important part of the story. I also do think there is this background that has made people more susceptible to this, despite the polling, right? They did vote for this administration. Some of it is COVID, and some of it is I painted a really beautiful picture that I believe about what science has done for this country. The biotechnology industry, semiconductors, the internet, fracking, the aviation industry. And yet, you sort of primed this, if you look at life expectancy for Americans without a four-year college degree, who are the majority of Americans, I'm guessing it's not the majority of this room, but it is the majority of Americans, life expectancy for those folks is back where it was 30 years ago, which is a shocking indictment of a modern society. And I do think that that kind of inequality and frustration helps breed the sort of anger that we have seen that then can go into science. Carol.
Yes, I would agree with that. Look, I think people want science basically to deliver on three things. One is to save lives. The second is to raise standards of living. And the third one is to create jobs. Now, if you look at sort of the pandemic, I think probably science deserves very high marks for the first one, save lives, but maybe not so much on the other two. And I think, sort of the decline for funding for science predates the pandemic. As I said, it peaked decades ago, and it's been on a steady decline. And I think it's important, so I would offer that maybe science has failed to deliver on each of these three for multiple decades now. We believe at least basic science is kind of the pacemaker of technological progress, and technological progress is how we end up with higher living standards. Now, since the mid-1970s, the U.S. economy's average growth rate has been far below the decades prior to that and before World War II. But moreover, as we all know, the overall increase in average income has been spread out very unequally. So I think there's just a large sentiment out there that even though the economy still grows pretty decently over the last decades, those benefits, what science delivers, have not been shared equally. And I think that's possibly explains sort of the waning political support, I think, for science.
And so many other institutions, right? I want to ask you all to look ahead a little bit. Carol's already done a little bit of that for us with numbers. Now I want to ask you to do it in a more human way. If we have these kinds of cuts, something on this scale, right? So it could be tens of billions of dollars a year. It could be more than $100 billion a year in cuts to science. What are we looking at losing? What are the kinds of effects? And I'm going to start with Jennifer, because I know you've thought particularly about both future pandemics and about potential bioattacks.
Yeah, and I just do want to follow up on that last point about science not serving people. I mean, and just take a very tangible example, which is if you look at life expectancy and what is driving the lack of life expectancy, particularly for non-college educated adults. You look at the leading cause of death, it's like cardiovascular disease, it's substance use overdoses, et cetera, and you really see a striking change in the life expectancy in non-college educated adults around 2010, 2015, which is really coincides with the opioid crisis. So just to say, so if you think about what are the levers of change to fix those problems, a number of them come down to scientific innovations that took decades to create, things like, if you think about cardiovascular disease, thinking about the medicines like the GLP-1 agonist, and then think about what is preventing non-college educated people from being able to get those. And that is less about the research, and it's more about our society, our economy, the incredible disparities that we see. So I do think it's important to disentangle these things, because research, science has only so many levers. There are broader policies that have to put those pieces together to make sure that everyone can access the innovations that come out of it. So I just want to say that.
That's really important.
In terms of the impacts, I mean, I'm someone who works in the field of global health security. So not only do we think about infectious disease emergencies, we also think about them in the context of deliberate events, right? I got my start in public health in the aftermath of September 11th, when for the first time we were thinking of biology being misused by people who intend to do harm. One of the main ways that we deter such things from happening is by taking them off the table, by saying we are not vulnerable to them, because, you know, if something were to happen, we could snap into place and make a medical countermeasure, make a vaccine, make a test, make a therapeutic really quickly. If I want to keep myself up at night in terms of what happened over the last 5 years, I think to myself, what if we didn't, within 1 year, have multiple safe and effective COVID vaccines? Like, that, to me, is a nightmare scenario. And you could call it a miracle, but that would ignore the decades of work that went into enabling that, to making that happen. It's it's not a coincidence that the innovations that came out of the United States was a leader on that, in part because of investments made over decades, investments in mRNA technologies, investments in vaccines, investments even in coronavirus vaccines, right? So now we have a moment where we just witnessed the enormous payoff of that, not just in terms of saving lives during COVID, but what those technologies are poised to do for treating cancers that were previously untreatable, other diseases, et cetera. And we are saying, no, thank you. We don't want that anymore. Not only will that harm us in terms of multiple potential avenues for cures, but it also removes the deterrence. It also removes the protection that the United States shows the rest of the world, the thing that says, don't come at us, because if you do, we are ready for it. And I deeply worry that. And I know from a global geopolitics standpoint, countries, including our adversaries, notice. They notice that. They notice that the US scientific enterprise is entering into disarray. And I agree that there are some parts of the country that are better than other parts. But I would say if you asked a scientist anywhere in the country, no one would say we are in a good situation right now. So if you're in that moment, and they're seeing that not only as a disarray, but we are also more polarized than ever. We have also taken off the table many other ways to protect ourselves because of the political fallout. To me, I really worry that we are more vulnerable for such an attack than we have ever been in our history.
Holden, help us understand, that is chilling. Help us understand some of the other potential effects that we could see in the next decade or two and beyond if we make these cuts.
Yeah, well, I mostly worry about, as Jennifer said, the loss of the scientific talent in the workforce. I mean, the reason we got the scientific enterprise that we have and the leadership that we've had, in part, was because at the end of World War II, people wanted to make sure that the talent that had gone to fight in the war, when they came back, they would do things that helped them and helped the country. And that's where a lot of these programs came from. And as you were talking earlier, over the years, we managed to extend them to people who hadn't had the opportunity to access them. And if you're a graduate student or you're an undergraduate who's about to finish college, thinking about going to graduate school right now to get a PhD in science, or if you're in the scientific enterprise already, you're in the middle of graduate school, or you're a postdoc, which is what you do sometimes after you finish graduate school, there are a lot of messages telling you not to stay. Now, my pitch is, when students ask me this, I tell them that a lot of people told me that I shouldn't go to graduate school in 1986 because of something that, looking around the room, a fair number of people here remember, called Graham-Rudman. Graham-Rudman was supposedly going to kill all this discretionary spending, and people were worried about that. And by the time I got out, as you're pointing out, there were multiple increases in funding, and we were okay. But, my timing was good, I guess, because I didn't finish graduate school and still a lot of that had washed out. But to me, the workforce, and if I were to say another thing that science needs to do differently, it's really not set up as well as it could be to prioritize the graduate students and younger people in the system above a lot of the people who have accumulated a lot of power. And we really need to flip that. Those people should be the most important people in the ecosystem. And so as we build this back, we really need to not only fix what is threatening young people in science now, but fix a lot of the things from the past that made it hard to be a graduate student and a young scientist in today's world.
Carol, how do you think about the economic effects of the potential economic effects of these kinds of cuts?
Okay, sure. Well, innovation is the engine of economic growth, and if there's less funding for scientific endeavor, you may deduce there might be lower economic growth going forward. And while high economic growth doesn't solve all problems, it is very helpful in solving quite a number of them. So let me give you, for example, the issue of our national debt and our high deficits. Higher income, higher economic growth automatically raises more tax revenues, reduces the deficit. And lowering the national debt and reducing deficits, it's a whole lot easier when the economy is growing at 2, 3, 4% as opposed to 1.5%. So that's one thing. Now, in terms of, it's very hard to quantify with great precision what the ultimate growth impact of the current budget proposals are. But as economists, we try to quantify those anyway. And sort of based on my own research, my best guesstimate would be that over the next 15 years, I can see, this is based on historical experience, a growth impact of about 20, maybe 30 basis points annually. So if the US economy sort of trend growth rate is like slightly below 2%, it will be like 0.2, 0.3% below that, everything else equal. Now, there's a huge caveat to that, which is that this is based on what we've observed over in the past in decades, what sort of the empirical link is between changes in federal funding for science and economic growth. It's very hard to establish that causal relationship with great accuracy. One reason being is that when funding changes and when you see the economic impact, it can take multiple decades. Okay, so it's a very tough question.
So if I hear all you saying, we are going down a policy road that is going to reduce our economic growth, increase our debt, make us less healthy, have fewer good jobs, and make us more vulnerable to attacks from Iran and Russia and other potential enemies, I would like to try to imagine how we might avoid that outcome. And so I'm interested in asking you, and this is a blunt question, but how can science fight back? And how can people who are alarmed by this, what can people do to try to prevent this outcome where we essentially step back from science? I welcome thoughts from any of you.
So I think, first of all, we have to try to prevent this from happening because when we talk about building back, first of all, you just can't flip it on and off, right? The losses that experience, the amount of investment and time that it would take to rebuild what gets shut down would be extraordinary. So that's the first thing. And so don't give up on efforts to prevail on, lawmakers about why this just can't happen. Secondly, we do have to look to other sources of funding to make sure that some of the work can continue. And I say some of the work because, philanthropies will play an important role. And if you're a philanthropist, please do consider playing a role in this. But it will never amount to what we're talking about. It will never replace or even come close to. But maybe it will help kind of stem the bleeding a little bit. I do think that there are important changes that we, and I'm going to speak on behalf of universities, need to make. I worry that the norms have been now so eroded because what was previously a bipartisan issue, science research, the unthinkable has just happened. And so I worry that, federal research funding, I think will forever have a a question mark next to it, just because it is perhaps not as stable or as a sure thing going forward than it used to be. So I think universities have to make important changes. It used to be, as an academic, particularly in the public health and medical fields, if you didn't have NIH grants, it was very hard to advance. I am a rare academic who built my career not that way, but nearly everybody else does. I would never have in a million years told a graduate student to follow the career path that I took, because I just didn't think it was reproducible. Now, as someone who has had other sources of funding, I have a lot of colleagues coming to me asking me how you do that. So I do think that academia needs to sort of change and sort of what funding sources it values, and that is important for the promotion of scientists in the field. So to give some value to other sources of funding. I also think a lot of what the people probably want more from us have historically been discouraged, because it is not, if you're in a field that has to raise money to cover every hour of your time, doing things like communicating to the public, engaging with the public, trying to understand what their research priorities are, trying to serve your communities, be seen, have your university be seen as a resource to the local community where you are there engaging with them, talking to them, educating them in different ways, et cetera. All of that is not funded. But I think universities have to step up and say that this is important for our survival. This is what we owe democracies. We need to not only enable this, but we certainly take down what had been previously barriers, whereas junior faculty might consider that doing those things were a distraction from the other things for which they were ultimately going to be judged when they are being promoted. So I do think we need to do that. I do think that we need to engage with communities more directly, be seen as a resource, partner with our local governments to provide our analytic power to help them with their problems. And I think that, if anything positive can come out of this, and I think if you look at the ledger tabs, the negatives far, far outweigh. I do think we need a bit of a cultural change inside of universities such that we, are less insular and more engaged. And I say this because if you look at the polling, when you ask people about the value of universities, you get these shocking statistics where the vast majority of people don't really value universities. They don't value four-year degrees. Those perceptions. And this is not the same as the perceptions around science, but the perceptions about the value of universities stands in stark contrast with the actual statistics about the value of the degrees that people get. So there is a disconnect, but I think to overcome that disconnect, one of the things we have to do is show up in people's lives in a way that they feel benefits them. And I think there are some opportunities to do that, but some of it I think is going to require changing the incentive structure and also creating more resources for faculty and parts of universities to engage.
And I would just add to that, Holden, before I know you want to get in, I do think academia should be self-reflective of the extent to which it has sometimes prioritized certain kinds of political beliefs over the objective search for truth. Large parts of academia, I believe, have sort of become an extension of the leftward most 20% of our society in ways that undermine it. And I think Americans really experienced this when they heard they weren't at all allowed to gather, they weren't allowed to go to church, and then a lot of experts said, wait a second, you are allowed to gather for progressive protest marches. And so that to me is just one example. You didn't make this point, I'm making it, but I think academia—
No, I did. I mean, I'm one of those experts that thought we should gather for protest marches, but as you know, I also thought we should gather for other things. I do think that we should self-reflect, but that doesn't require a culture change. That just requires being true to what is the underpinning of academia, which is intellectual freedom.
Yes.
Right? And so the freedoms to have various different viewpoints. And, I have, in the course of my academic career, said things that are deeply unpopular. And I have gotten, pushback for it. But that's what it means to be an academic. You say things, someone's going to argue with you, and you have to be able to handle it. And I do think that universities, have to just stick with that to continue to allow. I think there have been some instances in which, dialogue has not been allowed to proceed. And I don't know that that's ever been a university-led initiative, much more of a colleague-led initiative. But, that's what a university should do and have always done.
We have to get to audience questions, but Holden, how can science fight back?
Yeah, well, I think of course, as Jennifer says, the legislative process is incredibly important. We're talking about the president's budget, really, and we haven't been to the appropriations process yet, so the Republican senators that are going to be very important in that, I think they do support science, and I hope that we'll see a lot of that money put back in, and so engaging in that process from your state is incredibly important. But as far as the scientific enterprise is concerned, I think for one thing, we need to stop being so naive about how politics works. I mean, we love our data and our statistics and our charts and everything, but politics relies on anecdotes and storytelling. And so if you have I hear my colleagues complain all the time, oh, they're just using that one bad story. Well, sorry, but that's how politics has always worked. And so when there are problems with research integrity or when trainees are not treated well, we need to all come up and say, no, that's not consistent with our values. Because what we really need to do is, rather than saying, let's do this in response to what the administration is doing, which is kind of what we did during the pandemic, or let's do this in response to some other external force, the scientific community needs to come together and say, this is the scientific community that we want to build around the values that we have. The values of integrity and reproducibility and public engagement, as Jennifer's saying, and taking these other parts of the scientific enterprise that we've treated as second-class citizens and bringing them up to where research is, and prioritizing the young people whose careers can go in lots of different directions. And so if we build the scientific enterprise that we want according to our values, I believe it'll be what the public wants, rather than us trying to build it in reaction to some political or other force that's being imposed on us.
Okay, great. I asked Austin Goolsbee, who's the president of the Chicago Fed, of course, if he would kick us off with a reflection or question, and kindly agreed to do so.
I'm intrigued by maybe the focus on the immediate, and I totally understand it, a bunch of cuts in the short run. Could we take one step back and think post-World War II, Vannevar Bush basically single-handedly institutes a path forward for science in the United States that proves extremely powerful, also extremely elitist. He believes in the scientific elite, and the great universities should be driving the scientific discovery. The argument is essentially the federal government should get into science in a big way by outsourcing it to elite universities, because it'll be better science and it'll be cheaper than if the government does it itself. And we have that's great for science, that's great for economic growth. A lot of Carol's citations to, let's call it the social rate of return of science, come from that experiment. But I guess I would like us to think, if we come back in 10 years, not 1 year.
Yep.
Underlying some of our discussion here feels like, well, maybe if a new president came in, it would just go back to what it was before, and they would restore the government funding, and the NIH would come back, and we're back on the Vannevar Bush plan. What if it isn't? What if this kind of marks this is a demarcation point, that the government support of science through universities, that model's not going to exist anymore? Is it then conceivable that what happens is it goes to the private sector? That it would be like parts of computer science where the most path-breaking stuff is being done proprietarily inside of corporations, and it would be a little less, Santa Claus is done. But if that happened, it would be more applied research, I imagine, and less basic R&D. But applied research also has big spillovers on economic growth. Is that conceivable? What are the disadvantages of that world versus a university funding?
Yeah, so I think the main disadvantage is I don't think the private sector, and I wouldn't want them to if I was a stockholder, is going to invest in research that they don't know the next practical application of. But I totally agree with you that if we don't change the way science is operating right now, even if we get through the political moment, this whole thing will repeat itself again in the future. And so my calling is to try to get the scientific enterprise to realize that we've got to rebuild it in a way where the research, which is what we've always prioritized, and that's what pays for me to go to the grocery store because I run the most sought after journal, but the research has to be on the same level as the invitation of the American people into what we're doing. And we absolutely have not prioritized that for the last 80 years. And so we've got to rebuild it. And Jennifer's website during the pandemic was a great example of what can be done if we think about this in a way that says, you know, we can't do everything ourselves despite all our degrees and certificates and everything. And we have to partner with people who are going to allow us to build a scientific enterprise that invites people in.
I realize this is naive, but my world of the future would be we go back to the percentage of R&D spending from the Eisenhower years rather than just from, yes, right here. We'll get you a mic, just 1 second.
Thank you. I'm Bill Oberndorf, and I've been on the board of the University of California, San Francisco for 25 years, along with Diane Morris, and I chaired the board there for 9 years. We are the second largest recipient of NIH grants, $900 million a year. If this goes through as proposed, we will lose $250 million a year of funding. This is existential. What is going to happen? We can think out in the future, but what this appropriation is existential. I just took our chancellor back, spent a day lobbying the handful of Republicans who really understand this. We need to build on that base. You now are before Congress. You're testifying why the cut shouldn't happen. You've got 15 minutes. What are the 3 things each of you is going to say?
Okay, I'll ask for one a person, so we can get to a couple other questions.
So I think essentially it's very difficult to ask from the corporate sector, the private sector to engage in basic research because it's so risky and the benefits are hard to turn into profits and they occur far in the future. So my argument would be is that the social return for the nation of basic research is really, really large, and it is not something that the private sector easily can step in and make happen. So let me give you one specific example of the Human Genome Project, right, which in the end was $3 billion. It's a significant amount of money, but also not huge. That was actually, a project that was trying to find private financing. And it's very hard to do because once you sequence the DNA, the information is there for everyone to share. And so how do you then actually reap the rewards of considerable investment like that? And I think, although I agree with Austin that there's a lot of, in terms of development, experimental work that the private sector is probably better at than academic institutions, I think this is an example of investments that I don't think would happen if it wasn't for the public support. And I think the sort of the estimates that economists have of the rates of return of those kind of investments in basic research are just really, really large.
Yeah, when I give talks, if I was doing this with PowerPoint, I would have a picture of Bill Murray in Ghostbusters where he says, "Back off, man, I'm a scientist." And this is an example of what not to do. So my one thing would be to say thank you. It's a privilege to get to search the truth. Yes, we're part of this grand thing that's enabling all this stuff, but we're deeply, deeply appreciative of your investment.
So I would look at the panel, and I'm going to ask this room here, how many of you or your loved ones have been affected by cancer? How many of you or your loved ones have been affected by dementia? That's just 2, right? How many, so you referenced the Human Genome Project, right? And the advances to genomic science that has resulted from the Human Genome Project that has allowed people to have their cancer tumor sequenced to more specifically target those tumors, thanks to the incredible advances in genomic science that the Human Genome Project helped create. So if you want to see a cure for those hideous conditions in your lifetimes, you should not do this. Because all of those cures hinge on the innovations that come out of research projects, federally funded research, both at federal research institutions, academics. The private sector comes in later. They're an important partner, but they are in the later stages of research and development. They take what the innovative ideas and they translate those into products you can actually ingest or use. If you want to see those cures in your lifetime, you can't turn this off, because the things that are happening today are the cures that are going to be, 5, 10 years. I think that the timeline from the 90s to now, I think that the scientific discovery process is shrinking. So that's what I would say.
I asked Ken, longtime leader of Mount Sinai, if he can give us a closing question or thought. Here you go, on your left, Ken.
Thank you. Commentary and then a question. We're a hospital that gave birth to a medical school. We're not a university, and we have $500 million in NIH grants. With the cuts that are being proposed, just as you talked about UCSF, it's devastating. It's existential. This is unbelievable that these threats could be happening in our country right now. But I'd like to ask you to focus on something you haven't talked about. So many of our great scientists are immigrants. And the focus that we have on immigration today is also terribly destructive. I want you to comment on what do you think is going to happen unless we can get some bipartisan legislation that allows us to facilitate the immigration of some of the greatest scientists, young people who come to this country.
Yeah, I mean, if we're setting out the values that we're going to have a scientific enterprise around, it was an oversight of me not to add welcoming the best talent from all around the world. That has been a hallmark of everything that we have achieved. And to not do that, especially at the time when we're making it harder to become a scientist if you're an American. Wait, do we want more American scientists? Well, we're cutting that off. At the same time, we're cutting off our ability to welcome scientists from around the world. And so science is a public good. We should have people from all over the world here. The number of things that have happened that have been negative because of that are small, and we need to deal with those and thank people for the opportunity to have so many talented people in this country doing science.
And we need an immigration system that works, right? Part of the reason we've ended up here is because we had a system that doesn't work. Yeah. And maybe this is a good, hopeful note to end on. I hope that we will get... I hope that I hope we can come out of the Biden administration that went too far on immigration in one direction, and the Trump administration that has gone way too far on immigration in the other, and possibly actually have an immigration bill. And you can start to see some of them bubbling up in Congress. Ruben Gallego has offered one that both allows us to control our system as we have to, and allows for the incredible influx